It's during that first trip to Mississippi in 2000 when I first felt God nudging me. God telling me that there was something else in store for me beyond being a borough manager. So I started having conversations about what was happening with my pastor, Tim Patterson, on the right in that picture, who was also the leader of the mission team that went to Mississippi. These conversations took place every now and then as we planned and then made the second trip to Gulfport, 2008. Sometime in the late summer of 2008, I received a letter from Pastor Tim asking me if I would serve as a lay leader of the church and also on the staff pastor parish relations committee. Say that 3 times fast. The personnel committee, if you will, for the church. He explained that as I was considering my call, this committee would provide some insight into the workings of the church. So I accepted both invitations. It was early in March, not too long after the 2009 trip to Gulfport, when I received an email from the chair of the SPPRC. You didn't think I'd say that all out again a second time, did you? Telling us that the district superintendent wanted to meet with us that Saturday morning. Now, I have been somewhat new to the United Methodist Church, but I knew enough to know why we were being summoned on a Saturday morning. Pastor Tim was being transferred. So we met that Saturday morning, and Pastor Tim shared the news. He was going to serve Wesley United Methodist Church in Strasburg, Lancaster County. They have neat trains in Strasburg, by the way. It's funny sometimes, though, how God works. I first sensed God's call during the 2007 trip. As Pastor Tim shared the news, he explained to us that for him to sense it was time to move on happened during the 2008 trip. I've shared my experience of Doty's roof with you. But for Pastor Tim, while we were finishing that roof, he heard God tell him it was time. So Pastor Tim was excused from the meeting, and the DS, district superintendent, discussed with us what the next steps would be. First and foremost would be notifying the congregation the next day. That task was left to the chair of the committee. Let me tell you, this was one time for sure I was happy I was not the chair of a committee. See, I knew Sunday would be a difficult day. Like all of us, Tim had those who didn't care for him. But he also had many who cared greatly for him and appreciated his ministry. Yet even though I knew Sunday would be a difficult day, I was not concerned for the church. Yes, things wouldn't be the same. We would have to get used to a new pastor, and a new pastor was going to have to get used to us. Bless you. But for me, this was nothing new. Remember, I grew up Roman Catholic. Priests would come and go every few years, and the church would keep on going. And besides, in the 25 years or so that we had lived in Origsburg by this point, whoever would be replacing Tim would be the 5th pastor at Salem United Methodist Church. I wasn't so sure, though, about Team Origsburg. You see, those first 3 trips, Tim and his bride Carrie on the left, and that's their daughter Anna in the center, handled just about all the details, from making the arrangements to chasing down everyone for their paperwork to the publicity, renting the vehicles. They did it all. Now what? And it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one concerned about the future of Team Origsburg. After the announcement was made Sunday morning and the service ended, I waited till everyone else had greeted Tim and Carrie before I walked up to them. And when I got to Carrie, she hugged me. And with tears in her eyes, she said, "Mike, the team has to go on. You have to go to Gulfport next year." Team Origsburg was being pruned. The question was, how are we going to respond to the pruning? So today and next week, we're going to look at chapter 15 of John's Gospel. In the text we heard this morning, Jesus presents us with a new image. Last week, Jesus was the shepherd that cared for his sheep and would lay down his life for the sheep. Jesus compared himself to the religious leaders who he called hired hands. The hired hands, they weren't going to care for the sheep. Things got dangerous or risky, they're out of there. They'd run away at the first sign of trouble. Jesus, the shepherd, the good shepherd, would not. This week's image is a vine. Jesus tells the disciples and us that Jesus is the vine. We are the branches. In this text, then, Jesus takes it even one step further. He is the vine, but God is the vine grower. The shepherd will protect the sheep and lay down his life for them. But the shepherd is separate from the sheep. This image is different. This image is more intimate. The vine shares with the branches the nutrients that sustain it. The vine is the life force of the whole plant. The vine and the branches are one. Jesus tells us that God, the vine grower, pays attention to every branch. If a branch is not bearing fruit, it's removed. But the branch that is bearing fruit also faces the pruning shears, so it will bear more fruit. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I have no experience with grapevines. Supposedly, according to the description of this picture, this is what happens to a grapevine when you don't prune it. Doesn't look very attractive to me. I mean, there's all the nice pictures of the ones with all the grapes on them, then there was that. We had friends, Debbie and I had friends that we lived in Schuylkill County that planted grapevines. And they told us it would be 3 seasons of pruning and care before they would see any grapes. I think they sold the property after the 2nd year. When we bought our house in Origsburg, we planted spreading yews across the front porch. No, that is not my front porch. There were 6 of them, 3 on each side, with the steps dividing them. Every spring and then once or twice a summer, I would go out and take my pruning shears and very carefully remove the dead branches and then trim back the live growth so that it would grow full. If I had let those things go, they would have grown all over the place and would not have achieved the fullness like you see in that picture that we were desiring across the front of our house. Every year, those trimmed branches would grow. I am the vine, you are the branches. Without the nutrients from the branches, from the vine, the branches die. Jesus makes it clear that without him, we will not bear fruit. There's a word that Dave said 8 times from verses 4 to 7. One commentator said it was 9 times, and I went to 6 different versions and counted 8 every time. But we heard this word 8 times in 4 verses, and the word was abide. Jesus is telling the disciples to abide in me as I abide in you. Abide is an Old English word meaning remain, dwell, lodge, or continue. In the Message, Eugene Peterson put it this way: live in me, make your home in me. Jesus is saying, stick with me, and you will bear much fruit. Go out on your own, and you will wind up like the branch that withers. But even if we abide in Jesus, even if we live in Jesus and make our home in Jesus, we are going to get pruned so that we can bear more fruit. And sometimes pruning is not easy. Sometimes pruning can be very difficult. When I finally said, okay, God, you win, after arguing for 2 years, and enrolled in seminary, I had just achieved 25 years of service to the Origsburg Lions Club. But I realized that I could not meet my expectations for being part of the club if I was going to class 1 or 2 nights a week and doing homework the rest of the week. So I decided to leave the club. The last function I attended was the night I was presented my 25-year service award after I had already left the club. Talk about awkward. 2 years later, I was asked to serve as a lay supply pastor 3 Sundays a month to a little church about 30 minutes from Origsburg. For me, it was an opportunity to gain experience in planning worship and leading worship and preaching. But to bear that fruit, something needed to go. And Team Origsburg was pruned from the branch. Then, of course, there was the big pruning, leaving the job and selling the house we lived in for 30 years in order to finish seminary. It didn't take long after we arrived in Bethlehem to see the new fruit growing, the new relationships being made. After 2 years, that was pruned so that we could come to Salem and bear more fruit here in Pocono Pines. So as I look around this sanctuary, I wonder, how many others have been pruned? How many of us had circumstances in our life that resulted in pruning? Maybe it was a job transfer or a change of a job that meant leaving family, friends, and neighbors and moving to a new city or a new state. How many of us have had family members that moved to another state or country even after getting married? Can we see that as pruning? If we abide in Jesus, if we live in Jesus, can we see these life changes as God pruning us so that we can bear more fruit? Catherine Matthews reminds us that living in the promises of God will come with times when we experience the cutting away of what might have seemed to us to have been vital. Nobody said living in Jesus would be easy. Jesus said, I am the vine and you are the branches. Now, scholars tell us there's 2 ways to look at that statement. We can look at it as Jesus speaking to each disciple and us individually, or we can look at it as Jesus speaking to us and the disciples as a community. The key is how we understand the word you. In my time managing the borough, I served on the Chamber of Commerce Transportation Committee. One of the people also sitting at the table of those meetings was a woman who hailed from Texas. I would raise an issue from the borough perspective, and she would begin her comment with, y'all. So one day I asked her, if y'all is singular, what's the plural? And she answered, all y'all. So, if we read this text in that dialect, Jesus said, I am the vine, and all y'all are the branches. Jesus was referring to the disciples as a group. Jesus was speaking to the disciples as a community of faith. And I believe what Jesus is saying here is that we can't go it alone. And he is saying that to us as individuals as well as the body of Christ. We individually and collectively need to abide in Jesus. So what happened to Team Origsburg? How did we respond to losing our leadership? After we got back from the 2009 trip, Tim and Carrie called a few of us together and said, we could do this by ourselves with 10 people, but not with 40. We need help. So a handful of us each took responsibility for tasks that they had been handling on their own up until then. Because my job involved dealing with the press, I assumed responsibility for publicity and also agreed to presentations to church and civic groups. I'm shy, but they thought I could do it anyway. After the news of the transfer was announced, Tim approached someone who agreed to go to the training so he could assume the responsibility as team leader. And you know, we learned we could do things without Tim and Carrie. And that is not a put down of them, as much as it is an indication of how we were able to bear new fruit by abiding in Jesus. The next trip, we had a service ascending before we left, and started every day in Gulfport with devotions, and ended every day in Gulfport with a time of sharing, just like we did the first 3 years when Tim led each of them. Did Team Origsburg bear new fruit? It is now a 501c3 nonprofit, and along with the trips that are still happening, they just got back from one in West Virginia, it has also completed several projects in the local community, ranging from an ADA ramp for a family with a differently abled child to the renovation of a large garage into a 2-bedroom apartment. Team Origsburg is continually pruned. People come and go, but it continues to bear new fruit. In Salem UMC, well, they're on their second pastor since Tim was transferred. And based on the pictures I see on Facebook, they're doing very well. The pruning is difficult and can be painful, but it leads to bearing more fruit. Friends, God is the vine grower. Jesus is the vine that provides us the nutrients we need not only to live, but to bear fruit. In order to bear more fruit, God needs to prune us, individually and as a faith community. Whether or not we bear more fruit depends on how we respond to the pruning. Amen.